Well, turn back then with me, if you will, to Ruth and chapter 1. Ruth and chapter 1. Robert McQuilkin is probably a name that's not really known to many of you. And yeah, I'd like to share a story of him. He was at one time the president of Columbia Bible College in the United States. But in 1990, Robert McQuilkin resigned his post, and his reason for that resignation was recorded in the following note. It said, "My dear wife, Muriel, has been in failing mental health for about 8 years. So far, I have been able to carry both her ever-growing needs and my leadership responsibilities here at Columbia Bible College. Recently, however, it has become apparent that Muriel is content most of the time when she is with me and almost none of the time that I am away from her. It's not just discontent. She's filled with fear, even terror, that she has lost me, and always goes in search of me when I leave home. Then she's full of anger when she cannot get to me. So it's clear to me that she now needs me full time. You see, the decision was made in a way 42 years ago, when I promised to care for Muriel in sickness and in health, till death do us part. So, as I told the students and faculty, as a man of my word, integrity had something to do with it, but so does fairness. She has cared for me fully and sacrificially all these years, and if I cared for her for the next 40 years, I would not be out of her debt. Duty, however, can be grim and stoic, and so there's more. I love Muriel. It's not that I have to care for her, it's that I get to. It is a high honor to care for so wonderful a person." Robert McQuilkin made a covenant. He took a vow. He made a promise. Always to love, to cherish, to hold. In sickness and in health, in richer and in poorer, until death do they part. Robert had bound himself to his wife Muriel through this covenant, through that promise, a promise that he was upholding and keeping in that sacrificial way to his wife. Tonight we look at a sacrificial promise, a covenant, a vow that was taken by Ruth to go with her stricken mother-in-law. And there's a phrase that Naomi uses in the passage that we're looking at this evening that's a very rich Hebrew word. It's one that we've spoken of briefly before, and that word is chesed. Chesed means steadfast loving kindness. It means God's steadfast love, His covenant love. God's chesed is really His stubborn love for a rebellious people. And don't we need that? Don't you and I need that chesed, that steadfast loving kindness, as people who stumble and falter and fail and fall, who get it wrong more than we get it right? We need that, don't we? We need somebody who's going to love us with an eternal, undying love. Somebody that is going to keep their promise. Of course, we see that perfectly upheld in the person of Jesus, but we're not quite there yet. Last week, we saw the devastation that has entered into Naomi's experience. She has endured unbelievable suffering, heartache, and loss. She has no husband. She has no sons. She has no grandchildren. She has no hope of the family name and line being continued. She has no food. She has no means of income. She has no security. She has no inheritance. She has no family. She has nothing. She's right at the bottom. She is right at the bottom. And right in the midst of this absolute devastation, what we begin to see in our study of Ruth is God's chesed, his steadfast, immovable, stubborn, loving kindness at work in both Naomi and her unlikely daughter in law, Ruth. Now, what the first 5 verses of this book have done for us is they have created a really unusual situation for us in Hebrew narrative. And that is that a woman, and not just one woman, but two women, now occupy center stage in the account of Ruth. Naomi and Ruth are the main protagonists, the main characters within this story. And that's something that we kind of brush past. We think nothing of it in the modern age of gender equality, in the age of the rise of feminism and the equality in the workplace, etc., etc. The fact that a woman occupies the main stage, is the main character in a book like this, we think, so? It's par for the course, it's standard. Not in the first century, it's not. Well, not even the first century, way back. Not in the context into which we are reading. One writer said, the book of Ruth breaks all the rules as two unescorted women take command of the storyline and the men recede into the background. You might be thinking, yay, at last, some women taking center stage. But it is really important that we note that, because it is significant. You've all heard the song, I'm sure, in your lifetime. This is a man's world. I could ask you who sang it. I can't honestly remember off the top of my head. This is a man's world. This was a man's world. Very much so. Women were at best second-rate citizens. Women's roles were really childbearing. That was the long and short of what a woman's existence was. They were to be there to bear children and to care for the children, to look after the husband, and to continue the family line. That was the role of women. So a barren widow who's gone to a foreign nation with no family and with no future inheritance, well, that woman is one of the most insignificant, inconsequential, vulnerable, weak people that you could even imagine in the context of the day. Worth nothing. So we see the kind of picture that is being built up for us here. You've got these two women, they occupy center stage, but they're at the very bottom. There is nothing appealing about these women in the context that we read into. And yet, it's against that backdrop that God begins to teach us what faith and love and hope is through these two incredible women. Bear with me. Two things to consider this evening, with a number of subheadings under each. I forgot to put them on the screen. How does God's grace reach Ruth? And how does God's grace reach Naomi? Fairly simple. God's grace to Ruth, God's grace to Naomi. God's grace to Ruth. First of all, we see the vow, the promise, the covenant. Naomi has decided to leave Moab. Moab is the country that they had gone to as a result of famine. But now she hears that the Lord has heard the prayers of the people and has been providing food for them. The famine has come to an end in her home nation, and it is time to go back. Time to go back without a husband, without two sons, going back as a broken woman with absolutely nothing. Her two daughters-in-law, which would have been another source in some ways of disappointment, were Moabite women. Of course, the Lord's people were told not to intermarry with pagan nations or the enemy. That's just what the sons did. Not only had they left the promised land, but they had then married into a foreign people, a foreign nation, and as we'll hear, a fairly grim reality. So as she prepares to leave, and her daughters-in-law are with her, the two other widows in the story, Naomi is at pains to send them back. You must go back. There's this exchange of bitter tears, and eventually Naomi persuades, convinces Orpah to leave. And she does. She weeps again, verse 14. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and away she goes back to her people. But Ruth refuses. Ruth is tenacious. Ruth is definite. Ruth won't be dissuaded. She is going to stay with some folk coming in, I think, John, if you want to let them come in. They are with Naomi's with Ruth is with Naomi, and she is going to stay with Naomi. What does she say? Verse 16. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates. And then we read down at the end of the chapter that Ruth does indeed return with Naomi, but it's not just Ruth, it's Ruth the Moabitess. 7 other times in the story, the narrator reminds us that Ruth is a Moabite. What are we learning? Well, we're learning here how God uses the most unlikely of people. What do I mean? The fact that a Moabite would occupy center stage in this story is, again, another significant point that we are tempted to bypass. Who are the Moabites? I'm sure you all know. I'm sure you've all looked into that before coming to worship this evening. But just to refresh your memory, the Moabites were descended from a man named Lot, and through a fairly gruesome reality, through a drunken orgy, got 2 of his daughters pregnant. You can read about it in Genesis 19. The first son that arose out of that gruesome incestuous union was one called Moab, who became the father of the Moabites. The Moabites were the arch enemies of God's people. They were pagan. They worshipped the god of Shemosh, a god that demanded child sacrifice. So you kind of get the measure of who these people were. The fact that Ruth the Moabite is going to be used by God is significant. The fact that she is occupying the leading role in this book is nothing short of incredible. And it reminds us that God doesn't just use the together. He's not the God who employs only the qualified. We've said it before. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. He does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. He uses the unlikely characters. He uses the most unlikely of people, not the ones that we would expect, not the ones that the Pharisees expected, but quite often the most obscure and unlikely of people. Why? Because it shows his grace and his power and his love all the more, does it not? And that's what we see here, don't we? We see not just Ruth's vow, not just her promise, not just her grace to Naomi, but God's grace to Ruth. God's grace reaches down into this pagan land, this enemy-laden territory of people, the Moabites, and he draws out this woman from the incestuous lineage of the Moabites and says, I'm going to bring you to the promised land. And not only am I bringing you to the promised land, but I'm going to bring you into the family of God. And not only that, your new lineage, your new inheritance, your line is going to go all the way down to Jesus, the Savior of the world, the one who will come and who will deal with our greatest enemy, sin, forevermore. Isn't that the reality of the gospel? Isn't that the wonder of the gospel, of the God whom we serve and whom we worship? That God's grace reaches in to the most unlikely places, because that's who our God is. He is the God of chesed, that steadfast, immovable, loving kindness, that stubborn, eternal covenant love. And what we discover with God's grace in the life of Ruth is that it produces faith, and faith linked to an unwavering commitment. I wonder if you have experienced the grace of God in your life. I wonder if it's produced unwavering commitment. Do you have an unwavering commitment to your Lord and to your God? Do you have an unwavering commitment to His Word and to His church? Do you have an unwavering commitment to the lost, to the broken, to the devastated, to the needy? Has your faith developed? Has it produced an unwavering commitment like it did in the life of Ruth, as she committed wholeheartedly to this mother-in-law that was with her? And in that we see her faith in action, don't we? Because Ruth's faith is completely, utterly, totally counterintuitive. But isn't that the nature of faith? She leaves behind everything to follow God, Yahweh. Think about it. Ruth leaves empty-handed. Ruth leaves against intense pressure to the contrary from Naomi. And indeed, I'm sure from her own natural inclinations, it would have been far more logical, far more natural for Ruth to go back to Moab, to her people, to find a husband from amongst the people there that could give her some form of future, some kind of security. But instead of pursuing these slim prospects that she has for a husband and security in Moab, Ruth devotes herself, her life, to this old, bitter, twisted woman on her way to Bethlehem. And in doing so, she renounces her ethnic roots, her religious roots. She's abandoning her family, her familiar surroundings, her religious traditions, to take on the uncertain future of a bitter widow living in a foreign land where she knew no one, had zero rights, and would no doubt face all kinds of prejudice and persecution because of who she was as a Moabite woman. Utterly counterintuitive. Ruth is actually one of the greatest examples of faith in action that we find in the Bible. Because here's the thing. It's intuitive to live by what you can see. Yeah? But biblical faith is totally counterintuitive because we live by what we cannot see. Ruth couldn't see the promises of God, yet she followed him. It's a truly remarkable thing. So we see the promise, we see God's grace, we see faith in action. Secondly, we see God's grace to Naomi. Instead of starting with a vow, we start with a lament. Throughout the chapter, we hear Naomi's lament, don't we? We hear her brokenness, her bitterness, her devastation, her emptiness, her loss, her grief. And we mourn with those who mourn. We weep with those who weep. In her bitterness and in her grief, she cries from the heart, saying to her daughter-in-law in verse 13, "The Lord, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." That's where she's at. That's what she's thinking. That's maybe where you're at this evening. The Lord's hand has gone out against me. But you know, it's in the midst of her lament. It's in the midst of her lament that God's grace arrives. And He hears her cries. And He answers them. And what does He answer them with? Ruth. He provides a redeemer to Naomi in the person of Ruth. Notice what we read after Naomi's lament. "The Lord has gone out against me," she says, And at this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Insignificant? No. Go back to Genesis 2 in the original language and see the same word is used in Genesis 2. It's not good for a man to be alone. Therefore he shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Ruth's hands are clinging to Naomi in this fierce grip of love that will not let go. She is going nowhere. And in Ruth, we have an answer from God to the lament of Naomi. The Lord's hand has gone out against me. And Ruth clings to her. And Ruth sacrifices for her. And Ruth is not going to leave her. And then as we see Ruth's grace to Naomi, don't we? Ruth is now the face of God, in a sense, to Naomi. She's embodying the gospel to Naomi. And we see that in this powerful promise that Ruth makes, don't we? We see it in this oath, this covenant, where Ruth, in keeping with making an oath or a covenant, pronounces a curse or pronounces a curse upon herself if she doesn't uphold this covenant, if she doesn't keep this oath, if she fails to follow through on the commitment that she's making. She's literally giving up her life, giving up her security, giving up her comfort, giving up her dwelling to save Naomi. She's literally offering herself as a living sacrifice to answer Naomi's pain. Can you think of anyone else that did that? One who gave up their security and their dwelling and their comfort and their life for someone else, someone who was a living sacrifice. Well, of course, Jesus. Jesus turned his back on the throne room of heaven and took to himself the dust of the world, enduring everything that we endure, and taking upon himself our sin and our brokenness, so that we may be free from our lament and our brokenness. And you know what's remarkable about Ruth's covenant, her promise, her oath to Naomi here, is that it mirrors God's eternal covenant, does it not? Made to his people, Ezekiel 37, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. Here we go. The Lord and Ruth together. I will be their God, and they will be my people. A promise where God binds himself to his people no matter the cost. A promise where Ruth binds herself to Naomi no matter the cost. This is the promise that the Lord makes to us. This is the promise that Ruth makes to Naomi. And out of Ruth's lineage from this town in Bethlehem will be the definitive answer, not just to Naomi's lament, not just to Naomi's pain, but to all of our pain, to all of our laments. See how we can skip past this? But we see in Ruth's sacrificial, willing love, as we see in her counterintuitive faith, in her unwavering commitment, how it points us to the living gospel of Jesus Christ, where God himself, in the person of Christ, comes into the world and clings to us, taking all of our pain and all of our sin and all of our brokenness. God's answer to the cry of Naomi, to the lament of Naomi, is Ruth. And Ruth is this living picture of the gospel. You see it? What does this teach us this evening? What does it say to us? The first thing it says to me is that there's no place that I can go where God's grace cannot reach. Isn't that incredibly hopeful for us this evening? That there is no amount of darkness or brokenness or emptiness or bitterness or lament where the grace of God cannot reach. There is no amount of sin, there is no amount of brokenness that cannot be touched by His grace. We cannot get to a place in life where His grace cannot cling. God reached into the heart of Moab, and His love clung to this Moabite woman. God's chesed reached into the despair of Naomi, this barren, broken widow. It reached into her despair and clung to her through the person of Ruth. It's also a reminder to us again that faith isn't abstract, but there's a call to action, that our faith doesn't absolve us of responsibility. As we looked at already this morning, Ruth's faith was active. It wasn't just active, it was counterintuitive. She left behind everything to follow God. It made no sense. It was utterly counterintuitive, and yet she did it. I wonder, would we be willing to do the same? Are you willing to do the same this evening as God calls you? As He calls you to His gospel? As He says, I will cling to you and I will never let you go. Why? Because I love you and because you're precious. And there's no place that you could go, there's no place that you've been that I cannot reach. Will we live counterintuitively as the Lord's people and as His church? You know, there's a struggle that every one of us in this room struggles with, and I'm so aware of it at the point where I'm finishing for a few days' holiday, but that's rest, isn't it? Rest. We're all in this kind of pressure cooker of busyness. But you know, the Lord rested. He stopped. And actually, God's grace and His Word continually tells us to stop, to give Him a day, to devote Him a day. That the God of the universe is giving us permission to lay aside our jobs and our academics, our work, and to rest. But what does that take? It takes faith. It takes a counterintuitive act to let the world pass us by for a day. It's not what the world proposes, it's what the Bible proposes. The depth and the quality of Ruth's love is shown in her character when she binds herself in love to Naomi. Her love came alive once she began to love someone else. In the next chapter, we'll meet Boaz, and Boaz tells Ruth how the whole village is stunned by her love. And in the end, the women's chorus of Bethlehem celebrates Ruth's love because her character emerges when she's bound herself in love to her mother-in-law, to Naomi. What does that mean? It means that we are to love, and if we love with a sacrificial love, if we love with a love like God, with a chesed, with a stubborn and covenantal, eternal love, then it will be blessed. As we come alongside people who are struggling and suffering, as we cling to them, that we become a living embodiment of the gospel. Will we live like Ruth? Will we have faith like Ruth? Will we love like Ruth? It's not rocket science. It's loving with God's love, with His chesed. And when we do that, we become God's grace to those who are in need. Consider it an invitation. What a grand calling. What a grand calling to love with a sacrificial love that people may see Jesus. May we all be Ruths this week and always. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the gospel as exemplified through the life of Ruth. Lord God, we thank you that you reach into the brokenness of the world, into the decay of society, and that you save sinners. You draw people to yourself, and that there is no place that we have been, that there's no place that we can go where we are too far out of reach, that your grace cannot find us, that cannot heal us, cannot restore us. We pray that we would surrender ourselves to your pursuing love and to your grace that will not let us go, and that we too would become Ruths. We would have faith that we would put into action, that we would be counterintuitive in the way in which we live, that we would look for the broken and the bitter, that we would come alongside, and that we would love like Jesus, that we would give up the comfortable life that we have in order to show people the way to the kingdom of light. Father God, help us to be salt and to be light. Help us to be Ruth. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to conclude by singing a paraphrased version of Ezekiel 36. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will, not for yours, but for my name's sake, I will bring you home to dwell. Verse 4 there. I will put my spirit in you, that you may keep my decrees and obey my laws and statutes, for my covenant will not cease. To the land I gave your fathers, I will bring you from abroad. You will dwell there as my people. I will always be your God. Verses 1 to 4 and 5. To God's praise. We'll stand.
This is what the sovereign Lord said to